Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier at Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. This is part 2 of a midterm review which is offered to the Contracts 1 students here at Cooley, courtesy of the Black Law Students Association, or BLSA, the Tampa Bay chapter. The previous version that was just completed deals with offer and covers primarily week 1 of the material. Today I want to move into acceptance in week 2. With regard to acceptance, it is the second pillar of contract formation, the second component. We started with offer, and it had its elements, remember. Now we're talking about acceptance. It as well has very similar elements. There has to be an assent or an agreement or intent to enter into the bargain. Let me think about it is not an acceptance. I agree to pay the full price would be an acceptance. It also needs to be communicated. And the trick with acceptance is that with communication, there are certain special rules, including the mailbox rule, which I hope to cover at least a little bit in this segment. So we have the intent to accept, we have the communicated part, and we have this concept of responsiveness. At common law, there needed to be a mirror image acceptance, and that would be an acceptance that exactly tracked the terms of the offer with no changes. The business world, through the Uniform Commercial Code, has tried to make that a little bit more flexible so the acceptance could have a few changes or a little difference from the offer, if not so otherwise required by the offeror. And it would still be an acceptance and not a rejection counteroffer. I'll try to mention a little bit more about that a little further in this presentation. The acceptance is important when you see its elements met, because it sets the rights and duties of the parties. It sets the timing from which point the duties are undertaken and for which a lawsuit could begin if there's a breach. It sets what the terms are at that moment. And so it's an important facet of contract formation. One thing that was covered in the materials in week 2 was the adhesion contract. And what I'd like to say about that, just very briefly, is if you see two parties with unequal bargaining power, particularly where there is an offeror who is sophisticated and maybe is represented by attorneys, and you see somebody who's the offeree who may not have a college education, who may not have a lot of money, who may be a little bit less sophisticated in the nature of business, we may have the problem of an adhesion contract. And that's where one party offers with terms that are not very favorable to the other side, and yet the other side, the offeree, has very little choice but to accept. And as a matter of public policy, we have decided as a society to determine in cases of unequal bargaining power and adhesion contracts that the weaker party did not really give an assent. It looked like it, but it was not quite enough to be an assent, and the contract can be rescinded, the contract can be reformed. We'll talk about those in the end of Contracts 1. The case that we had was a lady who had a credit card, and then in boilerplate, in a huge package, fine print information, she was asked to accept, or required to accept, arbitration instead of going to court in case of breach. She didn't read it. Who would have read it? And yet if she used her car again, she was bound by it. And the case, that particular court held that it was not a knowing and voluntary waiver, and so she never assented to that new term. Their contractual relationship did not include that new and hidden arbitration clause. Okay? How do you accept an offer? The key is, if the offeror requires it, mirror image, exactly as the offeror states. Because don't forget that the offeror is master of the offer. Otherwise, if it's not so clear, you should favor the concept of acting reasonably. What if I asked you whether you wanted to buy tires? You could come in and pay cash. You could come in and bring a certified check. You could mail me a check. You could bring a credit card. All of those would probably be reasonable ways of accepting my offer. If I mailed you the offer, do you have to call me? Do you have to email me? Do you have to teletype me? Or can you simply send a letter back with all the information and a check? Would that be enough as acceptance? And if it's not so specified, the basic rule is if it's reasonable under the circumstances, shows the current intent, that's communicated, it's reasonable, it has definiteness of terms, then everything's fine and we have an acceptance to the offer. Can silence ever be an acceptance? And the answer to that is yes, if the offer sets it up that way or if it's reasonable under the circumstances. I might say to you, I offer to sell you my motorcycle, neighbor next door, and if you don't say anything by Friday, I'll assume the deal is on, and so you'll have the cash for me by Monday, and I'll give you the keys to the motorcycle on Friday night. Should be no problem with that if it's clear. So you can accept by payment, you can accept by promising to pay, you can accept by some kind of forbearance. I won't sue you if you give me $10,000 now would be an example. That's also a consideration example. But even silence operates under appropriate circumstances as acceptance. Okay? With regard to the communication, of course, the communication of your acceptance is important so the offeror knows that exact moment when he or she has an agreement. Because at that point, he or she then doesn't have that item that is involved to offer to anyone else. Is the motive of the person accepting an offer relevant? And the answer to that is no. That's often the case with regard to reward. I offer $100 if you find my dog. You don't need the money, but you bring the dog back because you're a nice person. I find out you're a nice person, and I try not to pay that $100 because I realize your motive is because of your kindness and not because you wanted to accept my offer of $100 as a reward. I have to pay it anyway. We don't look at motive with regard to when a person accepts. Acceptance, there could be conditions on acceptance, which I've seen show up in certain questions on midterms and on finals. Could I, for example, say, I will sell you my car for $3,000 on Friday so long as my father buys me a new car on Thursday? You see there that I'm making an offer for you to accept at a certain price on a certain date, but that offer, that ability for you to accept is contingent on something that happened beforehand. My father buying me an automobile on Wednesday. And so if that automobile is purchased, you then can make the acceptance on Friday. If the automobile from my father is not purchased, then you're not able to. So you can have the acceptance that includes a contingency or a condition. And so keep that in mind. Another issue with regard to acceptance is the concept of revoking the power of acceptance or terminating the offer. We've talked about offer, we've talked about acceptance. I'd like to talk about when the offer terminates and the offeree no longer has the time to accept. You can find information on this, very good sources, Restatement Second of Contracts, Section 36, for example, but there are other provisions that fall between Sections 35 and 49 that might be worth taking a look at. An offeror can leave an offer open for an unstated period of time or for a stated period of time, but the offeror can also make an offer non-revocable. Typically we call these option contracts. For example, I give you 1 week to decide whether or not you want to buy the motorcycle, and I must wait that long. I am not allowed to offer it to someone else. I could make the offer as follows. If you give me $10,000 by Friday, you can have the motorcycle, but I'm going to take the first offer of $10,000 or better. Then you have the ability, but I am not locked in to sell it to you. If I could change that, if you'd like, I could say, give me another $5 for the option, and I will maintain the offer open for you only until Friday, after which it's revoked, and then I can sell to anyone I want to. Okay? So we can create a non-revocability, but if we do that, keep in mind that that is a separate agreement. You've got the offer, the sale of the motorcycle, which you may or may not accept. We have the promise to hold that offer open and non-revocable to the offeree, not being able to offer it to anyone else for a certain period of time or for a reasonable time if not stated. That is a separate agreement, and that requires its own consideration at common law. So $10,000 for the motorcycle, $5 for me to leave that open to allow you to accept it and not have me offer it to someone else until Friday as an example. Okay? The Uniform Commercial Code has a firm offer, Section 2-205, Article 2, and that is as follows. If a merchant, this is a merchant-specific provision. Sale of goods means Article 2 applies, but this one involves a special rule if it's a merchant. If a merchant makes an offer that has a time of non-revocability, and it's in writing, it is binding even without separate consideration. And so the writing itself is evidence that the offeree can use to prevent the offeror from terminating the offer. And in other words, he's not able to revoke the offer, giving the offeree a certain amount of time to accept. If made by a merchant to a non-merchant or to another merchant. In this case, the relevant question with regard to merchants is it made by a merchant and it's a sale of goods? If so, then the period of time left open for the offeree to accept is locked in for as long as stated, or for a reasonable time not to exceed 30 days or 3 months. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about the mailbox rule. This is a default rule that is developed specifically to cover the situation where the mode of acceptance is not clear. The idea is if someone mailed you an offer in the mail, you should be able to mail back the acceptance. Question then being, when is that acceptance effective? Is it effective when I receive that letter back, open it, and know that you've accepted? Or is it effective when you put that letter, that acceptance, out of your hands, out of your possession, on dispatch? And the answer is, as default, it's dispatch. And you can change that as an offeror if you don't like that. You can make acceptance effective on specific knowledge. But the common law developed a rule where if the offer did not specify the mode of acceptance, anything reasonable under the circumstances, and it would be effective on dispatch, in other words, at the moment of dispossession from the offeree, and not effective on receipt. And so you have problems where, for example, someone mails the acceptance, it takes a few days to reach the offeror, and between the mailing and its actual receipt by the offeror calls to try and revoke. I revoke the offer. Well, too late, because 5 minutes before you revoked, I put that letter in the mail, we have a deal. And that is, in fact, the case with one exception. The exception would be, well, in fact, that would be too complicated, so I won't go into that at this point. I have 1 or 2 more topics to cover, which I'll do in the next segment.